One of the things required in our walk in this world with God is obedience. Obedience is important. It's important not only in our relationship with God, but in our relationship with our superiors in life, our bosses in the military, your commanders above you. Most military people know what it means to disobey an order. It can bring quite severe consequences. So can being disobedient to God. It can bring very severe consequences, and sometimes they are eternal. The Word gives us many, many scriptures on the subject of obedience. It's made very clear that obedience is very important in the eyes of God. The dictionary says that obedience is submission of one's own will, expressed or otherwise, to another or to an impersonal embodiment of authority. An instance of acting in such a way as to display this submission, also the sphere of such jurisdiction in obedience to according to the instructions of ruling of, in obedience to the dictates of conscience. What does it mean to be obedient? It means that you submit your will and you're not resisting the other person's will. You're not resisting God's will. He's telling you to go here and do this, and you say, no, I want to go here and do that. He's calling you to be an evangelist, and you want to be a pastor. Or he's calling you to be a pastor, but you don't want to be a pastor. You want to travel the world and be an evangelist. That's being disobedient to God. Very disobedient. Be what you are called to be. Every position is important. If you are called to simply be a lower level servant in a local church, that is your calling. You are called to the office of helps. Do it as though you were doing a great thing because you are. You're being obedient to God and what He's called you to. If we're truly obedient and not resisting, we will be submitted to God. True obedience always comes without resistance. In 1 Samuel 15:22 and 23, the first portion, we're told that obedience is better to God than sacrifice. People are always doing sacrifices for God, giving fasts or different things, but they're not being obedient. So, all of your sacrificing, all of your giving and offerings, all of your fasting, all the things people do as a sacrifice to God is irrelevant and useless if they are not in obedience to God. This was the reason that God removed Saul as king and placed the anointing upon David. David had a heart after God's heart. He sought what God sought. Walking in obedience is not one of the easiest things for a lot of us. I know it's not always been easy for me. Doing this was not easy, but God said, do it. So I'm doing it. We've been set free from the law and given full freedom to obey God. Under the old covenant, we were bound by the word of the law. Now we are no longer bound by that, but are free to truly obey God. In Romans 6:15 to 18, therefore, what conclusion should we reach? Let us go on sinning because we are not under legalism but under grace? Heaven forbid. Don't you know that if you present yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, then of that one whom you are obeying, you are slaves, whether it be of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to being made righteous. By God's grace, you who were once a slave to sin, obey from your heart the pattern of teaching to which you were exposed, and after you had been set free from sin, you became enslaved to righteousness. Being a slave to sin or being a slave to righteousness? Which one is better? It's an obvious answer. Righteousness is the better thing to be a slave to. Being a slave to sin will bring you all kinds of misery. We are all slaves to one thing or another. We're either slaves to God or we're slaves to Satan and the world. I want to be a slave to God, thank you. In Philippians 2, 5 through 11, we're told that if we are truly obedient, God will raise us up to such heights that we could never attain any other way. I've met so many people, they want to be a big evangelist on TV, they want to be famous, they want all this stuff, they want to go all over the world and do stuff for God, but that's not what God's calling them to do. It's not what God's telling them to do. And some people I know, especially from when I lived in Tulsa, I met a lot of people there. They came there to go to school to get trained up to go out and do a job for the Lord. And they're sitting there working in a gas station or waiting tables at a restaurant, waiting on God to do something so they can go and do this thing they think they're supposed to do. When God has given them the job to do, what they need to do is take a step. Sometimes provision doesn't come until you take that first step. You move, and God will meet you in that move. But you've got to be obedient to God for Him to be able to bring the provision. If it's His will, it's His bill, and the provision will come, not always before you make the move, but after you start. I've known people who God told them to go to some country and they couldn't really afford it, but they bought the ticket to go and they made the plans. And sometimes before they even got on the plane, the money came to cover the ticket. Or some of them, I know, it didn't come until they came home or while they were overdoing whatever it was God sent them to do. He's not always going to bring it ahead of time. The point is that we must be obedient to what He tells us. It's our duty to God. Deuteronomy 26:16 tells us that it's our duty to God to be obedient. Obedience is the price that we have to pay to succeed. A price, and the main price, is obedience. Saul lost his kingship because he refused to be obedient. He disobeyed God. He disobeyed the commands of God. Obedience is better than sacrifice. That's told in 1 Samuel 15:22 and in Jeremiah 7:21 to 23. It talks about obedience being better than sacrifice. Obedience secures our entrance into God's kingdom. Because without obedience, we cannot enter His kingdom, because that is one of His main things, is to be obedient to Him. In Matthew 7:21, if you notice here that the people Jesus is speaking of did miracles, they prophesied, they cast out demons, but based on what He says here, they were not true believers. They were not obedient to God. These are not going to get into heaven. You do not want to not get into heaven by doing works, but by not obeying God. It will get you to heaven faster than all the works in the world. But you must do the things He tells you to do. In Acts 5:29, Peter answers along with all the others who were with him, that we must obey God, not man. Always obey God. If his command is contrary to the local authority, then God is the one who wins. His command is higher. In Deuteronomy 7:12-15, because you are listening to these rulings, keeping and obeying them, Adonai your God will keep with you the covenant and mercy that he swore to your ancestors. He will love you and bless you and increase you in numbers. He will also bless the fruit of your body and the fruit of your ground, your grain, wine, olive oil, and the young of your cattle and sheep. In the land he swore to your ancestors that he would give you, you will be blessed more than all other people. There will be not a sterile male or female among you. And the same with your livestock. Adonai will remove all illness from you. He will not afflict you with any of Egypt's dreadful plagues and diseases which you have known. Instead, he will lay them on those who hate you. It's better to be on the side of those receiving this blessing than on the other side where these things are being distributed. 1 Corinthians 3:16 and 17, what it says there tells me that we are to keep the temple clean. Our body is the temple of the Spirit, not just in the spiritual, but in the natural. We are to dress in a fashion that's befitting of His house, not the standards of the world, but befitting of God and His house. In James 1:19-25, you come to understand that no matter what else you do, if you don't obey, everything you do is useless. If you're doing the opposite of what God is commanding, no matter how much you do, or how famous you get, or how rich you get, or anything else, it does not matter. It is useless. It's trash on the trash heap. You can do things that normally would be considered great in God's sight, but if you do not obey, it will mean absolutely nothing. In Romans 5:19, we see that the world became lost because of its disobedience. The disobedience of one man caused the world to be lost. The disobedience of Adam. Adam was the one God told, do not eat of this tree, the fruit of this tree. He did not say that to Eve. Adam told her not to eat it. God didn't command her. He commanded Adam. But Adam did not stop her, and the word says he was right there with her. But then he turns around and disobeys the command God gave him and eats of the fruit. And that brought the whole world to the position of being lost. Think what could have been accomplished if they had been obedient. Christ spoke on obedience in Matthew 7:24. And this is something that I've seen it before, I've used it before. The word rock that's spoken of in Matthew 7:24. The R stands for revelation. O of the C is Christ, and the K is kingdom. Obedience is the key to spiritual knowledge. John 7:16-18. Obedience secures blessings of divine fellowship. And in John 14:23, if you want fellowship with God, you have to obey him. There's a lot of other scriptures that we could have gone through. Obedience is what we must have. Obedience is first. We must obey what God tells us and the direction He gives us.